In this video, we'll look at something called the box model. But before we get into the details, where does the name box model come from? Well, essentially every HTML element is a box. So a paragraph, an image, or a button, these are all just boxes. But also a div with nested elements is essentially just a box with other boxes inside it. And that's why we have this thing called the box model. So every element is a box, and within this box, we can include content, padding, border, and margin. And this allows us to change the size, spacing, and placement of our box. Let's start with the content of the box. So what is the content? Well, everything between an opening and closing tag is the content of that specific element. So in this case, the content of our paragraph is just this text here, but it could also include nested elements. For example, within our paragraph, we could have a span element with the word box inside it. And because the span element is between the paragraph tags, it is also part of the paragraph's content. So that's one thing. Also, when you specify the size of your element, that will also become part of the element's content. So if I set the width to 200 pixels and do the same for the height, then our content would be 200 by 200 pixels. Now in your browser, open the DevTools by clicking on Inspect. And below you can see a representation of the box model. Now this is actually a tool which helps you visualize the different layers that make up an element. For example, we can use it to see what the actual content of an element is. To do that, first you click on this button here, and then you click on the element that you want to inspect. And once you've done that, the paragraph should be selected inside the HTML. Now hover over the content area, and anything that turns blue is the content of our box. And also in the content area, you'll see it shows 200 by 200, which is the size that we just set. So that's it for the content. Next we'll look at the border. The border is pretty straightforward. It's just a line or a stroke that you can add around your element. Let me show you. We can add a border using the border property, which takes three values. First, you specify the width of your border, which we'll set to 16 pixels. Then you need to give the border a certain style. And there are several styles you can choose from, but in most cases, you just want to use a solid one. And finally, we need to give the border a color, and we'll just go for black. And with that, the border is ready. It's also possible to leave out the color. In that case, the border will take on the same color as the text. And with the text being black, the border is also black. So if I change the color to, for example, red, then the border color will change accordingly. Now, if you don't want that, make sure you specify the border color. And we no longer need the red color, so we can get rid of it. So this is how you add a border to all sides of your element. If you want to add borders to specific sides, you can use properties like border top, border bottom, border right, and border left. So let's put the current border in a comment and try border bottom. And it works in the same way. First you specify the width, then the style, and finally the color. And this will add a border to the bottom of your element. Now for this video, we'll stick with what we previously had. Now the content and border are pretty straightforward. The ones that confuse a lot of people are padding and margin. Now before we get into the details, let's first understand the purpose of each. So what padding does is, it pushes the content away from the edge of the element. For example, in case of this button, the content, so the word submit, is really close to the edge of the element. So in this case, we can use padding to create space between the content and the edge of the button. Margin, on the other hand, pushes the element away from other elements. For example, here we have an image and a paragraph, and the paragraph is really close to the image. So in this case, we can add some margin to the top of the paragraph to create some space between the paragraph and the image. And this is where a lot of people get confused. Because in this case, whether you add margin or padding, visually it may look like you're doing the same thing. However, there is a big difference, which only becomes visible when you add a border. Because now you can see that with margin, you're adding space above your border. So the extra space is outside your element. However, with padding, you're adding space between your border and your content. So with padding, the extra space is inside your element. So my tip is to always add a border to your element first. because now we can clearly see that padding is not what we want, because we want to push our paragraph away from the image. So we should add space outside our element. I hope the difference is clear. Now let's see how we can use both of them. So to add padding to the top of our element, we can use padding top, which we'll set to 16 pixels. And this will create a 16 pixel distance between the content and the top border, which is the green shaded area you see here. And we can do the same for the right side with padding right. And let's set it to 32 pixels. So now you also have 32 pixels of distance between the content and the right border. Next we have padding bottom, which we set to 16 pixels. And finally padding left, and we'll go for 32 pixels. Now when hovering over the padding area, you can see the result of the padding we just added. And you can also read it here. We have 16 pixels on the top and bottom and 32 pixels on the left and right. Now instead of writing all of these, you can also use the shorthand property padding. And now you can specify all the padding values at once. And you do that in a clockwise order. So you start with the top, then right, then bottom, and finally left. So just like how a clock moves. And with that, we don't need these anymore, so we can get rid of them. Now in this example, we applied 16 pixels of padding for the top and bottom, and 32 pixels for the left and right sides. And in such cases, you can also specify only two values, where the first value is for the top and bottom, and the second value is for the right and left sides. We can also specify three values. For example, the third one could be 48 pixels. And in this case, the first value is for the top, the second value is for the right and left sides, and the third value is for the bottom. And if you specify just one value, like 16 pixels, it will add 16 pixels of padding to all sides of the element. Now, before we learn how we can add margin, first note that the paragraph already has a 20 pixel top and bottom margin applied to it. And this is something that's done by the browser by default. And the paragraph is not the only element that has default margins applied to it. For example, the body element has a default margin of 8 pixels. And usually we want to be able to control the margins ourselves. We don't want the browser to decide that for us, right? So what we should do is reset all the default margins to 0. And we can do that using the universal selector. And what this selector does is it targets every single element on the web page. And then we can just set the margin to 0. As you can see, all the margins are gone. Now, some elements also have some default padding. So just to make sure, you can also set the padding to 0. And now we can start with a clean sheet. Now, margin works similarly to padding. First, we have margin top. And we'll set it to 16 pixels. Now, if you hover over the margin area, you can see that there's now an additional 16 pixels of space above the box. So typically you use margin to move the element away from something else. Now we can do the same for the right side using margin right, which we'll set to 32 pixels. Next, we also have margin bottom. Let's go for 16 pixels. And finally, margin left. And we'll go for 32 pixels. Now, let's hover over the margin area. And you can see the margin we just added. So we have 16 pixels margin on the top and bottom, and 32 pixels on the left and right. We can also use the shorthand property margin. And it works similarly to padding. First the top, then right, then bottom, and finally left. And with that, we can get rid of these. Now, because the top and bottom will have the same value, as will the right and left, you can also specify only two values. The first for the top and bottom, and the second for the right and left. And if you specify just one value, like 16 pixels, it will add 16 pixels of margin to all sides of the element. Now, one final thing, you may have noticed that by adding padding and border, the total size of our element is increased. So our width was initially 200 pixels. However, we added 16 pixels padding to the left and right side, which increased our element's width to 232 pixels. Then we also added 16 pixels border to the left and right, which eventually increased our element's width to 264 pixels. And same for the height. We had 200 pixels. We added a padding and border of 16 pixels to the top and bottom, which made our height 264 pixels. The reason why this happens is because the box sizing property is by default set to content box. And with content box, the size of the border and padding are added to the total width and height. Now, if you don't want that, you can set the box sizing property to border box instead. And you'll see that the element size has decreased. Because with border box, we're now including both border and padding in the total size. So the size that we specify will take into account the content, padding, and border. These are all included in the size. However, although the element doesn't grow larger, it does result in a smaller content area, because now everything has to fit within those exact dimensions. Now, if you like this method more, you can always add this to your resets to make sure every element uses the border box model. Now, this works in most cases. However, it's even better to include the before and after pseudo selectors. Just ensure that it applies to pseudo elements as well.